Hello, this is exercise. Hello, we're Group B, and this is our presentation of the Group Assignment 7. The problem we want to look into is the effect of quarantine on the physical activity of college students. We all assumed that quarantine would have an impact on many people's physical activity, but we wanted to see if it mostly affected them positively or negatively. Our first assumption was that it would be a negative impact, as most would reasonably expect, since we were supposed to be indoors hoarding toilet paper and snacking on Ben & Jerry's mint chocolate chip ice cream. We used a random convenience sample of our first year's statistic class, which you are all part of.
For our data collection, we used 3 survey questions. The first was, how many minutes per week did you exercise before quarantine? The second was, how many minutes per week have you exercised since quarantine? And the third was, on a scale from 1 to 5, how much impact has quarantine had on your ability to find places to exercise? The first 2 questions give us a continuous response, and our third question would give us a categorical response since it was a Likert scale. The responses from these 3 questions are important because they would give us the amount of time each person had exercised per week before quarantine and since quarantine. And our third question would tell us how much each person felt that quarantine had impacted their ability to find places to exercise. After collecting our data, we found one very extreme outlier that skewed our results significantly, so we eventually decided to delete it from our dataset.
Analysis. In our experiment, we conducted an experiment of our Stat 19 class with 69 students, with 1 student being removed due to being an extreme outlier. Our variables are ranked order, categorical, and are continuous variables. In our experiment, we used linear regression and found a trend in students. Those who did more exercise before quarantine have increased, and so have the amount of exercise since quarantine, which is a positive linear trend. Looking at the data for this scatter plot, we see that quarantine hasn't had a large impact on an individual's ability to find ways of exercise, with most students answering 1 or 2. Results. From our data above, we see that the mean difference in minutes of exercise between the before and after data. From comparing this data, we have found that minutes of exercise before quarantine is higher than minutes during quarantine. And seeing the average answer of impact quarantine has on finding the ability to exercise compared to our other data, we find that most students didn't have trouble finding a place to exercise. Our hypothesis is as stated. Null hypothesis. There is no difference between the physical activity of those who answered 3 or higher on a scale and those who did not. Alternative hypothesis. Those who answered with a 3 or higher on the scale are more likely to have more than 400 minutes of physical activity per week since quarantine. The probability of a type 1 error is 5%, only if your null hypothesis is true. The probability of a type 2 error depends on the sample size and on how different the proportions truly are in our 2 populations. Testing our null hypothesis, based on the p-value 0.2096, we have failed to reject the null hypothesis. We can conclude that those who answered higher on the scale are more likely to do more than 400 minutes of exercise after quarantine has ended. Having a confidence interval of 0.2049 and 0.1131 for our data, and our t-score was found to be negative 1.6292.
Our biggest question while doing this project was always, how exactly did the quarantine affect people's physical activity? But we were surprised when we came to the conclusion that generally, people who both didn't have too much trouble finding ways to exercise, and that many who answered other than 0 before and after quarantine had higher minutes of exercise after quarantine than before. This certainly piqued our interest because we had thought the opposite would be true. Of course, this is a better outcome. So for an implication, one implication about the population that our results from our sample could be that overall impact of quarantine had limited people's ability to find places to exercise, which led to a lower amount of minutes of exercise per week since quarantine.
We could improve our study by having a bigger sample size, and we could also improve it by asking more questions that could more accurately show the effects that quarantine had on people's ability to find places to exercise.
Some bias that exists in our study is that people don't exercise at all. So there are some students that may say they didn't have an impact on finding a place to exercise because they don't exercise at all in their daily routine.
In conclusion, our data showed us that that quarantine had a positive impact on the amount of time people exercised per week, and our study had some minor biases and outliers that could be easily fixed in a follow-up study.
Thank you for listening to our presentation. And as always, cheesecake.